NATO expansion has been a topic of discussion since the end of the Cold War. Russia's annexation of Crimea and its ongoing activities in Ukraine have brought the issue of European security and the role of NATO to the forefront once again. Remarks from Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel provided the kickoff to a special event at the Wilson Center. His remarks and the discussion that followed are the focus of this edition of Rewind.
NATO expansion had been agreed upon in the 1994 Brussels Declaration, and there was real enthusiasm in 1998 to ratify the addition of 3 countries to NATO, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And 16 countries have now been added through 6 rounds of enlargement since the end of the Cold War. Here to keynote and kick off our conversation is Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who was elected to the Senate in 1997 and voted for NATO expansion.
America did not make commitments abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Instead, President Truman joined the North Atlantic Treaty because he said he was convinced that NATO would serve as a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression, and thereby let us get on with the real business of government and society at home. Truman joined the North Atlantic Treaty because it was, as he put it, a simple document that, if it had existed in 1914 and in 1939, would have prevented 2 world wars. NATO would ultimately protect security and prosperity here at home with this alliance, a truth that I believe endures to this day. NATO must balance a renewed emphasis on territorial defense with its unique expeditionary capabilities because, as we have seen, threats to the alliance neither start nor stop at Europe's doorstep. And we cannot take for granted, even in Europe, that peace is underwritten by the credible deterrent of military power. In the short term, the transatlantic alliance has responded to Russian actions with continued resolve. But over the long term, we should expect Russia to test our alliance's purpose, stamina, and commitment.
How much thought was given to potential blowback from Russia? In other words, from your observation point there, was there really a sincere desire or at least intention that if Russia evolved in a certain way, that it could become part of this community?
I think there's a consistent record on the part of NATO, and beginning in really with the first visit of the Secretary General before even the collapse of the Soviet Union to Moscow, to reach out to Russia in a spirit of cooperation. And that's remained the case, I think, in terms of NATO's approach to Russia. I think that it's sincere in terms of the understanding on the part of NATO countries that, in fact, Europe's security and many issues in global security requires cooperation from the Russian Federation, and that working out the challenges in that relationship going forward would be important.
Let's jump to the present and Ukraine and the kind of challenge that Ukraine, the situation there presents to NATO. Mr. Prime Minister, what would you say, I mean, what kind of a challenge is this for NATO? What can NATO possibly do about what's happening in Ukraine?
There is one element of that crisis which will be very difficult to be solved: the fate of Crimea, the future of Crimea. That is a part of a Ukrainian state, country, that was stolen illegitimately by an aggressor. If we really believe in rule of law, if we really are serious about values and principles of international law and so on, we have no other option than to say Crimea must be given back, returned to Ukraine.
What about public opinion in countries like the US or Germany, Ambassador Ischinger? I mean, would the German public support a military response if Russia were to attempt a sort of Eastern Ukraine kind of destabilization campaign in one of these NATO member states?
Of course, that would be a totally different ballgame. If we're talking about Article 5, if we're talking about the members of NATO, then we're really in serious territory. But and I think in that case there would be no doubt that we would need to come up with determined action, and at that moment should not rule out even military responses. we have reached a point where hopefully once the dust has settled of this awful Ukrainian crisis, we will need to take a sharp look again at how we can, over time, construct a European order, a European security architecture, as we like to call it, that is good for us, but also okay for Russia.
For more information on Russia, NATO, and European security, visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org.